Thank you again for everyone joining us from our last Tips from Alumni for this particular semester. This session is dedicated to our teacher education program. So we have some lovely alumni on here that are going to give you some tips and tools to think about when applying, or if you're currently in the program, for the teacher education programs that we have here, as well as our moderator, which I'll get a chance to introduce in just a second. My name is Jordan King. I am Assistant Director of Student and Career Services here in the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh. So I, along with Latoya, Madison, and a couple other people, put these together just to, connect everyone to our alumni, as well as current students and current faculty members, to really allow you all to see a glimpse into what it's looked like to be an alumni of the program, specifically with teacher education. So without further ado, I have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Michelle Sobolak. She's an associate professor of practice in our Department of Teaching, Leading, and Learning, and she's also the Director of Teacher and Professional Education here in the School of Education. She's going to be our moderator here today, and I will let her introduce anything else that she would like to introduce about her particular self, and then she will be leading us through the rest of the panel. So I will hand it over to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Jordan. So as Jordan said, I'm Michelle Sobolak. I direct teacher education here, but also am an alum of Pitt myself. So I received my master's degree in reading specialist certification through Pitt, as well as my PhD in literacy education. So I guess I'm here on two fronts, both current faculty, but also an alum myself. And I'm excited to be here today with our distinguished alumni who have come to talk about their experience at the School of Education, answer questions, and just share a little bit about what their careers look like now. So without further ado from me, I want to hand it over to who you are here to see and ask our panelists to please share a brief introduction of yourself and what brought you to the School of Education at Pitt. So I'll just go by how folks are on my screen. So Eliza, you're first, if you can introduce yourself and what brought you to Pitt.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Eliza Luxbacher. I teach 7th grade English at Fort Couch Middle School in the Upper St. Clair School District. And I'm a graduate of the CASE program at Pitt, and that's really what brought me there. I have lots of members of my family who all went to Pitt, and so I grew up coming to Oakland in general, but in exploring options for education, the CASE program stood out to me for so many reasons, but especially the idea, or like the opportunity, to get both my undergraduate degree and my master's degree within 5 years. And as someone who really appreciates like the psychology aspect of learning, I loved that I was able to study applied developmental psychology, in addition to education itself. So I'm very thankful for the opportunity and happy with the decision that I made.
Thanks, Eliza. And Neil, you're next on my screen, if you don't mind introducing yourself and what brought you to Pitt.
I'm Neil English. I'm the superintendent of the Riverview School District, which serves the small communities, Pittsburgh communities of Verona and Oakmont. I am a trifecta Pitt graduate. I went to Pitt for undergrad, my master's, and my doctorate after getting a professional certification up at Sacred Heart, Connecticut. But what originally brought me to Pitt was, I was pre-med as an undergrad, and Pitt kind of offered an array of different classes, different kinds of programs. I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do, and I knew Pitt's programs across a number of fronts were excellent. So if I decided I didn't want to do one major, I could move to another major and it would still be excellent. So I finished undergrad with pre-med. I joined the AmeriCorps for a year, ended up in a lot of inner city schools. Those were really great experiences. So I came back and got my MAT. I was a grad resident director on campus at Forbes Hall, which was an interesting experience. And then a few years later, even living in Connecticut, where I did most of my teaching and my administrative work, my early administration work, I loved Pitt so much that they were offering some remote opportunities where I could just come in, and it gave me a reason to come back to Pittsburgh. And I loved the university so much that I continued on with my doctorate there. But Pitt's a great education program. And of course, I had a great experience in undergrad and in my master's. So I just kept going. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks for coming. You are like a super alum, so you can speak to all the different levels of experience you
That's
have.
right. That's right.
And next on my screen is Brianna. So if you want to go next.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brianna Ross. I am, Eliza and I have a lot in common. I'm seventh grade too. I'm a seventh grade assistant principal. I attended Pitt. I also was in the CASE program, which is absolutely what brought me to the University of Pittsburgh. I also have family members who attended Pitt, so it was an easy choice. But when really choosing programs, CASE just absolutely stood out to me. Like Eliza said, the dual certification was incredible. And I talk about Pitt all the time. Since I no longer live in Pennsylvania, I am now right outside of Baltimore. And I am hands down always that Pitt was the best place for me to go to get my education. I came out of the CASE program really feeling, especially starting as a fifth grade elementary school teacher and starting with lots of other new teachers. And I felt light years ahead of where they were in terms of preparation. And so Pitt really was the best place. Like I said, I started off as a fifth grade elementary school teacher and then moved to middle school. In my last years in middle school, I taught social studies. I was a social studies department chair. In 2022, I was named the Maryland Teacher of the Year. And then I moved into administration. So I have been an assistant principal at my current middle school for the last 2 years. And I'm very excited to be here.
Thanks so much. I'm so glad you mentioned Maryland Teacher of the Year. I would have added it in for you. And next on my screen, Tim.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thanks so much for having me, and students, thanks for joining in late in the day to hear from us. It's a pleasure to be here. I began my career as an elementary school teacher and was looking for graduate programs. I'm a native Pittsburgher. And as I was thinking about where to continue my education, it finally dawned on me that what a wonderfully excellent national reputation Pitt has. Why not just stay in the town that I love and grew up in? So that was very appealing from the outset. How highly regarded Pitt is, and as Eliza mentioned, what drew me to Pitt was within the School of Education, the Applied Developmental Psychology program. So that's where I spent my time as a master's student. Really understanding more from a developmental lens of how and why learning happens for young people. And then again, loved Pitt so much, as Neil shared, that I continued on and completed my doctoral work there in school leadership right after the master's program. So it became a community and a place filled with classmates and also professors that made learning engaging and really pushed thinking in an excellent way. And I think that's translated to my current role, which is as a high school principal. And so leading about 1,300 students and a little over 100 teachers has been great. I miss my days as a second grade teacher, but certainly I think it is Pitt that allows us to think broadly about experiences and translate practice and theories from second grade to 12th grade. You can learn it all at Pitt for sure.
Thank you, Tim. And last but not least, we have Shaun.
Hi, everybody. I'm Shaun Tomaszewski. I currently serve as the high school principal at Baldwin High School. I have had a few administrative positions. I've been a curriculum director, started the K-12 STEAM Magnet program for Pittsburgh Public Schools. Before that, I had a faculty position at Mount Lebanon High School, where I taught biology and chemistry. I got into education while at Pitt. I have BPhil degrees in microbiology and neuroscience, and like Neil, I too was planning on going to med school, and I spent 2 years volunteering at Children's Hospital and realized I hated interacting with patients, and 2 years in the Department of Anesthesiology doing research as an undergrad. Realized I hated working in a lab, and so I was asked to be a teaching assistant my sophomore year in the chemistry department and fell in love with teaching. So after I finished my BPhil degrees, I started my MED in science education, and then a few years later I started the EDD program, and my advisor convinced me to switch over to PhD. So I have been chipping away at my PhD since 2013, and I'm currently ABD right now, finishing up my dissertation.
That's exciting. Thank you. Thanks to all our panelists for introducing yourselves. I have some questions, so feel free to jump in to answer these. You're welcome to everybody to give their perspective. If you don't feel like you have something to add, we can let those folks who are ready to jump into each question do so. So starting off, was there something you wish you knew before entering your respective program? And if so, what was that? How would it have helped you at your time here in SOE?
I'll start off. I wish that I would have been ready for the time commitment required for student teaching. While I was student teaching, I had an adjunct faculty position at CCAC. So I'd student teach during the day and then run over to CCAC and teach until 10 o'clock at night. I think if anything, really, it prepared me better for my first contract year as a teacher, where you're trying to run around, plan lessons, make copies, get ready for labs. And really the level of rigor and expectations that the School of Education had set me up for that hustle that was challenging, but ultimately, made me realize that ultimately it's worth it.
Shaun, I think what you shared is so common from our students, who enter the MAT program or other teacher prep programs, kind of underestimating the time commitment to student teaching, and to being, a new or a novice teacher as well. I think it kind of bleeds into that as well. Anybody else, something you wish you knew before entering?
I'd say one thing for me is, in the midst of all of that busyness, as Shaun said, to really save time to continue to build relationships with the people that are student teaching with you at that same time, with the faculty that you're spending time with. Sometimes it's easy to get lost in all of the lesson plan writing and the PA educator creating your application materials and just a lot of technical kinds of things, but it's really in the network that you're building and the relationships and the time you're investing in those relationships with the people at Pitt that 5 years from now will be most important. Lesson plans will have been important, but much less so than the people you stay connected with. So for me on the front end, I was very wrapped up in doing all the assignments well and all the thinking just right, but leaning into the relationships and being intentional about carving out time for that is really important and something that you can't get back after you're in your degree.
Right. Okay, I will have another question for you all. What did you learn in your program, hard or soft skills, that have been really helpful in your current role?
I'll start for this one, if that's okay. But the thing that came to mind, because I was just, previewing the questions that you had shared, and immediately I thought reflection, because so much of what we do at Pitt, or what I did at Pitt, was like in every class, we constantly were reflecting through written reflection, through talking, collaborating. And that's something that has been incredibly impactful for me as an individual, something that I now do as part of my daily routine and personally, but also in my work professionally, and also something that I've made a crux of my classroom. We constantly are reflecting, and I got that from Pitt. So for me, reflection came to mind, which I think is both a soft and a hard skill. It's all the skills. It's the most important one.
I like that, Eliza. And I might take what you just said to current students who feel like maybe they're over reflecting, just your point of view about how that helped. And I think it's probably that thought comes from just that time management issue, right? But now that you're speaking to how it has impacted you as a teacher and what you ask your own students to do. So I'll be squirreling that one away to share.
Yeah. I think it's similar to your point, with even lesson planning in undergrad and grad school, how the depth of how deep every single lesson plan has to be. And I think in the moment you're this is so time consuming. I don't need to do all of this, but it's really scaffolding your thinking so that you can automatically do it. And I think that reflection was built the same in my undergrad and graduate education.
Great, thank you.
One thing that I'll share that I think I'm so much more aware of now as an administrator is professionalism. I don't think I've realized how much I got that from being in the case program and being at Pitt, but I very much remember, and I still have it, so it's still something that I have with me in my office, is creating our portfolio binder and being able to go to interviews and having this full binder of resumes and lesson plans and sample behavior management charts, and how critical that was. And I remember doing interviews when I first started, and how critical that was, and how impressed people were with that. And even just, I think, in the case program, one of the really wonderful things that I think we got from that program is being able to be student teaching every single day, being at the school from the beginning of the school year, pretty much virtually to the very end of the school year. And so I think in doing that, I really understood like what the responsibilities of a teacher were, but just those professional things like showing up on time, how you show up, how you communicate. And I know that now, having to do like conducting interviews with teachers, and I'm like, if they came out of case, they would not show up this way, right? And I think I was so well prepared in their classes. And I think what Eliza said, just like the depth of everything. Like now I know that that portfolio that I went with, no one's ever no one I think ever really looked through that portfolio. Nobody cared about all those things, but I think just being so impressed with that and really fully showing up prepared. And so I think I was really ready my first years in teaching for just how I needed to show up, even how to network and how to talk to people. I really think I got that from case, and that was like a really, really important skill that has still translated for me even now as an administrator.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Brianna. I think that's a hard lesson some students get as they enter the profession, or that transition from being a student to being teachers of students, and that professionalism jump can be tough, but how important it is to learn those lessons in your program, and then you're ready to launch into the career.
Well, I'll say something. I think Pitt offered, in my job, to be successful in upper administration, you have to have the ability to sort of take in a host of diverse perspectives from, I serve a pretty diverse group of people. And I think Pitt offered a lot of really interesting learning ideas, different perspectives, and you have to take all of those in and be thoughtful about those ideas in order to think through a problem or make a decision or serve a community. And so I think I'm grateful for the experience that Pitt offered diverse teachers and diverse topics and challenging topics, things that made me think, things that made me stop and consider a different perspective. I feel like that is, I'm constantly required to do that in the current position I'm in. So in that regard, I think the experience set me up fairly well for, the host of different things that I have to do as a superintendent. So
Yeah,
that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, really important skill though, right? For any teacher or any administrator. Thank you.
Michelle, I'll jump in just quickly with I guess not so much a soft skill, but I think one of the takeaways from Pitt in terms of the the hard skills is that you're receiving as students at Pitt the cutting edge research in terms of how to teach well. And so I'm not suggesting not to follow the curriculum when you get your first job. But what I am, encouraging, I guess, as part of this, and based on what you've learned at Pitt, is to question and to, think critically about, the school system that you entered, because what you're learning today is very much the best thing to be doing, and that's not always the case in schools across the country. And so it's important to, hold tight to some of those more technical pedagogy sorts of things that you're learning. Because the teacher next door may not have those same tools, may be looking to you for some of that more recent, ways of teaching. And as a young teacher, to not, shy away from, some of those skills that you've developed, or the things that you've learned about, even if it's not happening, among people that teach on your teaching team.
Tim, that's an excellent point. And I saw that whenever I joined the faculty at Mount Lebanon, and I was fortunate my colleagues were really open to feedback and those new perspectives. So I absolutely echo that.
Yeah, we always hope that something, right? The teachers and administrators come out of Pitt wanting to be change agents, right? To take things forward and to really challenge the status quo, because we know that is needed so much in the field of education. So kind of having the ability to do that, having the background to do that, and the desire to. So great points. Thank you. So I'm wondering if you can talk just a little bit about your experience as, a master's student at Pitt. What was it like on the day-to-day? Some of you have referenced this in terms of the challenges of the time management in student teaching, but what was it like to be a master's student at Pitt, which is a little different, right, than those of you who also did your undergrad here. It's different to transition into a professional master's degree program.
I'll jump in. That for me, that master's year was just the 1 year of the case program, and it was probably like my most favorite. That was like my most enjoyable experience, I think, at Pitt. The way the case program was set up, we were in classrooms all day, every day, Monday through Friday, the full school day, and then we would leave right from class and then come back to Pitt and have class every day. And so I'm really glad that Tim mentioned making connections. And I think it's so important to have community because those days are really, really long. And so it is really important to have people that can support you, that you're going through that experience with, because it's not easy. And it's also nice to have people who are gonna help you knock these assignments out, work through that binder with, be up with you late at night to get those things done. That was also really important. One thing I also really wanted to mention that I really appreciated about Pitt's master's program is just the emphasis on research. I know very few people who have gone through master's programs who have done the kind of action research that I did that fifth year. And I think, and as someone right now, I'm also in a doctorate program and working through research, and so much of what I got from Pitt in terms of the research process, what that looks like, how to do it with fidelity, was just so foundational. And I was really, really appreciative that that was an experience that I got to have to really do good action research and see what that looks like as a teacher. What does it look like to do research as a teacher? So I really appreciated Pitt for that experience, and it really set me up really well to go into a doctoral level program.
Thank you. And it's great to hear you're in a doctoral program as well.
I think being a graduate student, this is going to sound kind of funny. Maybe I felt like a grown up for the first time. So much of being an undergrad, I still felt like things were sort of planned for me, and the path was laid out. It was in a graduate program where I had to make the decision that Saturday mornings I was going to spend my time at Hillman Library and carve out those 4 hours. That became a non-negotiable, and it felt again like a grown-up thing to have decided. Using one of the questions in the chat to kind of frame this out as well. When I was pursuing teaching positions, I did have a part-time job, and it was nice to have flexibility in that position, in that part-time job, to work hours that blended with being an undergrad. Then as a graduate student, I was teaching and then heading into Oakland 3 evenings a week for classes. So definitely the concept of balance, is critical as a graduate student. Laying out a map for yourself at whatever point in the week it makes sense to make sure those next 7 days, that your mind's clear about what your goals are. Because I think that can be the hardest part is, just making sure. We had a superintendent once say, you have the choice of being the flagpole or the flag whipping in the wind. So, ground yourself and be the flagpole so that you don't become the flag in the midst of a busy time as a graduate student.
Thanks. Well, so much about teaching, why most people get into it is they want to work with youth. They want to impact, the future. So I'm wondering if you could just share one of, or the biggest lesson that you've learned from your students. And I'm sure there are many, but one that comes to mind that you'd like to highlight for this group.
I can share that. And you know, it's interesting as a principal to try to design and implement programs that support kids' needs for their futures, right? There's that classic trope in education that we need to prepare kids for their futures rather than our past. And somebody mentioned earlier how much inertia there is associated with the educational system. And I think, you know, I'm a huge proponent of giving kids the experiences that they need. Sometimes in education, you hear people advocate for voice and choice. And with 1,400 teenagers in my high school, if we listen too much to the teenagers, you know, we might not be offering the most academically sound courses of study for them. But I think that with as disruptive as new technologies like the large language models that are coming out now, we really, I think, are at a crossroads in education in terms of preparing kids for their futures. And so I think engaging in dialogue with them is super important. We have faculty at the high school who are implementing artificial intelligence applications across the board and in all content areas to help kids get ready for that next step. So it's a challenging balance, I think, to listen to kids regarding what they want and what they need, and still using your professional expertise and judgment to make sure you're setting them up for success in the future.
Thanks, Shaun.
I mean, students are joyful. They have their whole world in front of them. And I think that's the biggest thing to take away from young people. They're happy, they're joyful for the most part. And these jobs that we're in are difficult. There's a lot of emotional fatigue. You're meeting the needs of a lot of people. So it's important to realize that, you know, you have to have some fun at your job, or see your job as joyful and fun. And I think that's what young people bring, you know, exuberance and excitement and joy. And if you don't have those in your job, you're not going to last too long. So oftentimes I'll just get up from my desk, I'll go and hang out with the kindergartners for just a few minutes and remind myself of, you know, why I'm doing what I'm doing and why this job is fun. And so I'm constantly doing that just to, you know, get into the classroom, see the kids, see how excited they are, and then try to, you know, borrow some of that joy to infuse into the rest of my day or the rest of my week. So that's what I take away from the kids. That's what they give to me personally.
To build upon Neil, you want to speak?
No, Eliza, go ahead.
I was just going to say, to build upon that, I think for me, my favorite part is like the shared humanity of like, you spend so much time with your kids throughout the year, so much time, and like the things that you experience together, like that are happening inside school, outside of school, in the world, you remember those moments and how you shared the space and created space for one another through those times. And then just to like see their growth, to like acknowledge your own growth and that shared growth together. That's my favorite part, just like being together and appreciating that time and the relationships that you build in that time.
I want to just piggyback off of both what Dr. Neil and Eliza said, that one of the things that I think is like so critical, and I've always worked in what we would consider like high needs populations. And so what Dr. Neil said is so right. Like, this work is also really hard. And more than anything, I think what I know I've experienced is like real true compassion fatigue. I think it's what I feel very strongly about as an educator and as a teacher is that, and certainly for the students that I work with, that this work, my work, has just always been rooted in love. And if I'm not like, if I don't love my students, then there's nothing good is coming out of the work that I'm doing. And so I've always led with love, but that's also really exhausting. And so I think one of the things that I've really learned, especially in the last few years, like post-pandemic, is if I'm not taking care of myself, then like I'm never going to be able to take care of them. And so I think that's something is people who are going into the profession and stepping into teaching, that it's so important to know that, and I won't even say self-care, I hate that concept, but like the idea that like this work requires real true self-preservation. And if we're not doing that, then we're not going to be able to give, because this is a job, this is a service job, 110%. We are service, we are in the business of serving children and their families and our communities. And so I think it is so important that we are maintaining a level of preservation for ourselves and drawing healthy boundaries. And for me, sometimes that's about the level of emotional investment that I put into the work, because that's also really exhausting. And so just being really mindful that compassion fatigue is very real, and this work can be very exhausting beyond the lesson planning and the teaching. Just the being there and the listening and the loving and the learning, like that part is hard too. And so just making sure that you're mindful of how best to take care of yourself is really important in this as well.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that's a lesson students in our program sometimes learn while they're in the program. I think, we often hear, I didn't realize how much work teachers have to do outside of the classroom. I didn't realize how much you take home, the trauma maybe your students bring to the classroom, or how your students, like Eliza said, experience what's happening in the world outside, and how you have to help them unpack it, which might not have been your lesson plan for that day, right? So I think hearing that early on and thinking about that self-preservation is really important.
Michelle, just to piggyback off of that, Brianna, thank you for bringing that up. I think that's huge. And I will say to the future teachers, if you ever work for a principal who expects you to be working every single night and on the weekends, that's an indication that that's a school culture that you might want to remove yourself from or avoid in the first place. I constantly tell the faculty that they have to preserve their own sanity. And so, if you're in a school that's giving you coverage during your prep period, or pulling you away from assessing student learning during the school day rather than just saving it all for evenings and weekends, that's a super toxic school culture that you want to avoid at all costs.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think this question really lends itself to a question that was put in the chat too, which many of you answered in there, and I appreciate that, but maybe we can talk a little bit about it here too. The balance between working outside of your program and how you handle the program. And I think it's a personal question, right, for how people manage their time. And I think as a program, we certainly understand the need to work, especially with the rising cost of higher education and just in the world around us. But we also always try to talk to prospective students about if you're struggling in your academics, if you're struggling in your placement, sometimes that outside work has to be the place that we look to free up sometimes. So I wonder if you all could speak to a little bit about how did you balance working to support yourself and pay your tuition with what you encountered in your program. And it probably really relates to this kind of, how do you have self-preservation, right, when you're under a lot of stress?
For me,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I kind of alluded to this before. For me, it just became very, very technical. I became rigid in when and how I did things for the period of time that I was trying to do everything, meaning be a student and work. Whatever could get done in particular windows of time is all that would get done. And then I think the next step in that was kind of psychologically, allowing myself to be okay with that. So Friday from 4 to 6, I would do my work for Pitt. Saturday from 8 to noon, I would do my work for Pitt, and that would be that. I learned to be more efficient because I didn't break some of those boundaries that I created. And so I think, it's a temporary state that you're in, balancing being a student and working. And because it's temporary, I think you can kind of work your hardest to coach yourself into being really rigid if that works for you. Obviously, if there's a Saturday morning, you just need to sleep in. You shouldn't deprive yourself of that. But, I think the more that things can be scheduled in for this period of time, 15 months, 24 months, then it all becomes a little bit easier after that.
Sorry, I don't remember. I just don't remember much about I feel like, you know, you think back, you're like, how did I do that? You just did it, you know, you just get through it, you do it, you prioritize, get your assignments done, you work at the same time, and you just do it. I'm not going to sugarcoat things and say it was easy. I don't remember it being easy. I remember it being difficult, but in some ways that's good preparation for the field, and that the field is difficult. So
It's probably your mind too that doesn't have you remember the challenge of it, right? Once it's over. I think we can speak about that so many things in life, you know, how did you get through that? And it's like, looking back on it, it didn't seem, but in the trenches, right? It's tough. It's tough to manage being a professional, to be, you know, in a teacher prep or admin prep position or program, and to do some of that outside work.
I could also add, so I'm currently an undergraduate student. I'm a junior in the CASE program right now, and we've had at least one class each semester of the program so far that has a requirement for community engagement hours. So you need, I think, 20 community engagement hours for the course. It counts towards your like your credit hours, but you can be paid for those experiences. So the professors in these programs, like they know that we work, and you have an opportunity to get back some of those hours you're working, yes, through your paycheck, but also through credits. So for example, I tutor, and that's something I spend a lot of time tutoring every week, but I also get some course credit for it. I can use it to write reflections and complete assignments. So really the professors are aware that, you know, it's a lot. And the way that the course is designed with the schedule, there's time throughout the week to work because the vast majority of us do work. So it is a lot to juggle. Personally, I do not get to sleep in on Saturday morning, so I'm jealous of whoever brought that up, but you know, you get through it.
And I think Eliza spoke to it too, and what she included in the chat is probably being mindful and strategic about your work too, right? You can have a job that also gives you opportunities to work with kids, to learn more while you're on the job and getting paid. And Laura, I think that's what you spoke to too with tutoring and saying, you know, I can work with students, I can hone my skills while also getting the hours I need for courses as well. I think it becomes a little more challenging for those of you who did initial teacher prep programs, particularly when you're student teaching. And we always ask students to be mindful at that time of the outside work, if it feels like it's becoming overwhelming, while also keeping an eye on the need to work and have an income. So my next question, a lot of students always are asking us about the job search, particularly in our one-year programs. That job search begins pretty quickly after you begin the program. I just ran into an MAT in the hall on my way down here, and I said, oh, how are you? And she said, I had my first interview. So, you know, she's in a 15-month program. She's already interviewing in early March. So I wonder if you all could talk a little bit about your job search experience after you graduated from the School of Ed.
I can speak to that, Michelle. This question just popped up in the Q&A too from Lisa that I chimed in on. I was fortunate that my student teaching supervisor had the contract position open up at the high school that I was student teaching at. And so I was able to interview for that position and slide into it right after student teaching. That being said, throughout the student teaching process, I very explicitly advocated for myself and asked the head principal to come in and do full-on formal observation series with me. So he knew the type of teacher that I was, the type of teacher that I could grow into being. And that's something that I share with student teachers at Baldwin all the time. Like they have to hustle and make themselves a known entity in the school. And it never ceases to amaze me how we have student teachers show up, clock in, leave the high school, don't really impress people. And, you know, it's like they never even existed. So I would encourage the students to make themselves known in whatever schools they're student teaching in, so that if a contract position opens up, then they're already leaps and bounds ahead of the other candidates in the applicant pool.
Thanks, Shaun. We always talk about student teaching as being, you know, a semester long or a year-long job interview, right? You're known well by the folks in the space that you student teach in.
To build upon that, sorry, we keep talking over each other.
It's clearly the middle school, seventh grade.
It's clearly the middle school. We think very similar. It's the CASE program too. I think, like, and this connects to like a piece of advice. I know that was another question to think about, like what advice to give. I think to Shaun's point, it's just like communicating with whomever you can and advocating for yourself. So that would look like when you are student teaching within your school, trying to take advantage of any opportunity you can to go into different classrooms, to have different experiences, to help and volunteer at events at school, and to just be visible in any way that you possibly can be. And when you start interviewing and looking for jobs, just like reaching out, sending emails to people, introducing yourself, giving them a little, like a preview of who you are, what you care about, following up after interviews, demonstrating that you're interested, demonstrating that you care. That's what I think of when I think about like the process, because it is tough. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of energy and effort when you're applying and interviewing for jobs and communicating with people, and it's a lot, but it's worth it in the end, for sure.
Thanks, Eliza. Brianna, did you want to add to that about your job search?
Yeah, mine was a little bit different, but what I do very much remember is the perk job fair. Does that still happen?
Yes.
I very much, yeah, I remember the perk job fair and that being like such an important. I remember like all of my CASE, everybody in my cohort, like all of us going there and being there at like 7 a.m. in the morning. And so many of the people in my cohort got jobs because of that job fair. And their opportunities came through that. My experience was like a little bit different. So before the summer, or I don't know, maybe the year before my master's year, I did an internship at a charter school network in New York. And because of that, I was hired like immediately before, like going into that master's year, I had a teaching job. And I say that only because for anybody who is, you know, here, undergrad or graduate, if there are other kinds of opportunities that exist outside of Pitt, opportunities for internships, fellowships. Mine was a fellowship with Uncommon Schools in New York. And if there are those other kinds of opportunities that might be interested in, look into those too. That was one of like the most foundational experiences that I had as a teacher, and really helped me become like a really solid teacher. And so those experiences are also important. So I think to what Shaun was saying, like building your network also really helps. Because I had that, and then I did student teaching. My student teaching was done at Langley. I did all of my student teaching at Langley and Sheridan, and they had positions opening up that next year. And the principal was like, if you want to stay here, this is what works. And I decided not to, but I think, you know, building those networks or building those contacts and that network when you're in your student teaching experience is also really important, because those are absolutely job opportunities, especially now when school systems look very different in terms of staffing. At least that's what it looks like in Maryland. Teacher shortages are very real right now. And so people want qualified teachers. And so building those networks is really important.
Thank you. I just noticed in the Q&A, Dr. Ortiz's class is Zooming in, which is awesome, to this panel. And she's asked some questions that some of the panelists have been kind enough to answer in text as well. But they are reading a book that I also discovered in the past year, Troublemakers, Lessons in Freedom from Young Children in Schools by Carla Shalabi. And I apologize if I'm butchering that last name. But the class is asking a bit about, you know, how do your work with quote unquote troublemakers or students with behaviors disorders teach us? What does it teach us about dismantling harmful school structures? And a related question, so feel free to jump in on either, is how does the lessons from a book like that, what do you take from that? And how do you see freedom show up in your own classes or schools?
think that's a great question. I'm jotting down the name of the text because I'm not familiar with it, but I'll jump in. An idea I thought I had a little bit earlier that I think could be a start to thinking about this question is through rapport building, relationship building with students, we understand a little bit more who they are, and so in that way we're able to provide them with an environment that meets their needs. And so the concept of classroom equity is not everyone getting the same thing. It's everyone getting what they need as a learner. And so building relationships to get to that point so that students then can see you as an adult that can be trusted, an adult that cares about them. I think a lot of the the issues that we see in classrooms are mitigated simply when students, one, feel love, and then two, encounter instruction that's responsive to who they are and what they need, which could be very different than the child sitting next to them.
Other folks, can you weigh in on what the quote troublemakers have taught you about, what needs to change in the education system, and or can you speak to a little bit about how freedom and justice shows up in the work that you do?
I think too, and I responded via text to this question earlier, but I think so much of student misbehavior boils down to disengagement. And so when I work with new faculty members who are having classroom management issues, I focus on their instruction and assessment design, because when kids are engaged in opportunities of authentic inquiry that are developmentally appropriate to them, so many of those misbehaviors start to melt away. And that is sometimes a frustrating reality because we like to recapitulate the same educational experiences we had as students. And that's just not possible right now. Kids are inundated with so many short-term stimuli that shifting our pedagogies to engage them requires us to be pretty divergent than what we were shown or what our teachers did with us while we were in school. And so something as simple as implementing station activities into a high school classroom can really be transformational, because instead of a 45-minute lesson, kids feel as though they're just engaged in shorter 5-minute activities. And then that also frees up the teacher to engage in small group direct instruction, which is also huge. And that's something that we high school folks, I think, can learn a lot from our elementary colleagues who incorporate those sorts of instructional design elements into their practice that you oftentimes don't see at the high school level. But it can pay huge, huge dividends with high school kids too.
Thank you for sharing that. Another question in the Q&A that Brianna has answered in text, but other folks, if you could weigh in, working with families. So how do you handle working with families who are, are certainly our partners in the education of their children?
Well, working with families. I work in a very small school district, so we have a family approach. We know the families know us. And because of that, things work a little smoother. You have a little bit more rope. With parents, they give you a little more trust, a little more latitude in terms of when their student comes home, you can tell them a story. They'll usually call us and allow us to provide some context to that. But I think really most of the job, and I know that in your classes you're learning about pedagogy and all these important things, and those things are certainly important. But without taking time, I think Tim talked a little bit about this. You have to get to what is the movie? Jerry Maguire, the Quan. You have to get to the Quan of of the students and the families. And if they don't think that you're listening to them, or you understand them, or you care about what they think or what they say, you can forget about it. You can have the best teaching pedagogies in the world, and it's not going to work. You know, they're gonna shut down and be disenfranchised. So I think a key ingredient, and something I always tell young people in the profession, is that, you know, this job is about relationships. It's about building relationships. It's about understanding somebody else's perspective. It's about being calm and patient and listening more than talking. So that's the message we try to send. It doesn't always go perfectly. We still have people in our district that are upset, that are angry about things, but we approach it calmly and respectfully, and just sit and listen and try to get an understanding of where people are coming from. And when people really believe you're doing that in a genuine way, usually they can come to the middle and you can figure things out, solve the problem, move forward.
I got some really amazing advice from a principal. She wasn't my principal. I didn't get to work for her, but when I was teaching elementary school, she said these two things were non-negotiables. I'm glad I took her advice. The first was to spend time the very first weekend after the first days of school, calling every home and talking to everybody for 3 minutes, every family. So elementary, 25 students. That was key. And then she also said on the roster that you have at your desk, next to each student's name, write down one thing you're going to do for them or their family outside the school day. So it might be watching them at a youth football game. It might be going to a violin concert that they have. There might not be something so obvious. And so it's about, again, returning to the family to say, hey, how can I see your child in life outside of school? So for anyone that's going to be in a setting where maybe you have 25 to 50 students, those would be, I think, some really concrete ways to build relationships with families. It gets a little trickier at the secondary level, but I don't think it's impossible. But as Neil was saying, it's in those moments that you can listen, you can be on the sideline with the parents. And so I think there's a lot of power in that.
I was going to share that, Tim, because when I started teaching, Tim, you gave me that advice about calling families and right after the school year began. And so I have 115 kids. And so I tried the call thing the first year and it was so meaningful, but it felt a little bit unmanageable for me. So what I do now instead is I ask all families to write me a letter about their student at the beginning of the year. And I actually send that email before the school year starts. So they can start, sending those letters. And then I give a response, a detailed response to every single letter. And I compile all the letters into a Google folder so that all of my teammates, all of the teachers and adults that work with the kids read the letters and have that background information about the kids too. And it just starts the year off by building that meaningful relationship with the families where they feel like, you care about their student inside of school and outside of school as well.
Just one thing I want to add to what Eliza said, because it just made me think of something that I do as well, that families really love. I have 397 seventh graders, so I don't get it from everybody, but I've had my families write letters to their children so that when their children are having bad days, I'll just slip it, right? They'll just get it randomly. So they write their own letters to their kids so that just when a kid's really struggling and they need a word of encouragement or just a good note, I'll just slip it to them. So that's another cool for any teachers. It's just another cool strategy to do. It's just a way to engage with your kids and with your families.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you, Eliza, Brianna, Tim, Shaun, and Neil for sharing your evening with us, sharing your experiences, your expertise, and your advice with folks who are currently in our teacher prep programs or who are considering it. I know that Jordan put a great plug in, as did Brianna, about the PERC job fair, about mock interviews coming up next week. And I'm going to hand it over to LaToya to talk to prospective students about how they can join us in the School of Education and get in on these amazing experiences.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Sobolak, for being our panel. Thank you, our panelists, for joining us today and being here. Thank you, Dr. Ortiz, for bringing your class and having them join in during class time to hear a little bit more about this. So amazing, amazing to hear. As you saw, we provided some, of course, the dog hasn't barked the entire time we've done the session, and he does it as we do it now. So we provided you with some information here. If you are interested in joining any of our teacher ed sessions, we do have teacher ed information sessions bi-weekly every Monday at 4:30. So feel free to join one of those. You can also learn more about our programs to talk to us with our admissions email address, which is soeinfo@pitt.edu. We again thank you so much for joining us today. We are always here to help you, and I think just about all of our alumni on panel, if you need some advice or want to talk further, we can definitely make sure we connect you with that as well. So thank you again for joining us this evening.